Stephen, if I'm listening right now and I've got a thinking, you don't know my family. My family, Stephen, is different than these other families you
Mhm.
guys are talking about. And my, let's my uncle or my father or my grandfather is not, and I've seen this, is not willing to relinquish any control. And I don't know if they ever will. I think they're going to be carrying out here on a stretcher. And and they ask for input, but then they don't want input. And then these people, they 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 have a lot more influence than they say they do. You with me? When they come in the room,
Mhm.
and you and I know when that's happening because when we start showing up around these families, it's it's what they say and then how everyone acts around what they say. And if you're in a family right now and you feel that you've got someone at the helm that is not willing to relinquish control and is constantly creating issues, what do I do about that? Well, what can you say about, for family members listening that have someone that's really controlling things? And I think that person probably is even listening today, whoever they are, the controlling folks, because they don't typically show up for things like this. Um, what input do you have for them and trying to at least getting their message heard? What kind of
Mm.
advice do you give folks in that circumstance?
Which- that's a good. So I'll give you again some quick direct example. So this was a family I dealt with some years ago. They they had exactly that happen. So one of the G3s really wanted his voice heard in the family business, and the grandfather was not listening, and the grandfather basically made all the decisions, simply cut across the space, controlled the entire family dynamic. This was a very large oil and gas family. So I said to yeah, and you can do that. This is almost like a tiny practice in itself. I said to that particular person, you're not aware of it, but you have a pattern with that. Let's say it's the grandfather, and let's say it's the grandson. You have a particular pattern with that grandfather that he's probably aware of, but he just unconsciously activates in you every time, and you actually react to it every
Mm,
time in the same way.
mm,
So I encouraged him to get really comfortable, take a few breaths with me, and then find out where is that relationship with the grandfather? Where's that uncomfortable part that feels like he's control every time? Where is it sitting in his body? Is it his
mm,
head? Is it his throat? Is it his heart? Is it his belly? And then I got him to put his hand on his belly because that's where it was, and then ask what that part of him needed to change or needed to know in order to change to the dynamic. And when he went into that space, he said, "Oh, it's so simple." He said, "Every time I get there, I'm like a little." I remember a time with my granddad when I used to be like a little kid, and he'd sit me down with all his friends, and he'd point out exactly all the best way to do a card game or have a. I said exactly. I said it's that card game probably that actually has set in motion all your patterns of yeah. And he said, yeah, because I just used to, Granddad was so good at the card game, I was just in awe, and so I just let him do what he wanted, and he scored. So I said, what about if you take control of that card game yourself? What about if you make the next move? And he said, yeah. He said, you're right, I've never done that. And I said, well, what would that feel like if that part of you that has been all these years simply been the silent participator in the card game, what move would you make? And he
mm,
said, oh God, he said, look, I'd probably play an ace of trump, I'd do a trumps game. They were talking 500 or whatever they were talking. And I said, okay, where does that feel? He said, oh God, that feels so good. It's sort of like my heart's opening. I said, right. So the next time that you deal with your grandfather, why don't you imagine that you're actually in that card game with him, but you're leading. You're going to actually lead and you're going to guide him as if you're playing a trump hand. And he said, oh, he said, you've no idea how I relate to that because of what. So, and then he told me he went into the next meeting with his grandfather. And when his grandfather said something, he actually brought up the game and he said, Grandad, I used to relate to you like when we used to play cards and Granddad said, immediately lightened up because he remembered that. He
mm,
said, I remember that card game. And he said, well, look, I just want to play you a hand now. And he said, this is what I want to play. And then he told him about one of his ideas. It was just a small idea. But the granddad said, but it was a whole different donor. And the granddad actually listened and said, oh, my, let's talk about it. And then it shifted their relationship. So sometimes it's a little shift in the energetic dynamic that can actually change a whole family system. And it just is all to do with your awareness and you landing in a place where you're aware of the dynamic
Yeah.
between you and that controlling person. And you shift that dynamic inside yourself first. And then you actually do one tiny thing to actually shift that dynamic when you meet the person, and it will shift everything.
Um, I'll add one more piece to that and we'll wrap up here is I think when we realize there's a dynamic, right? And Stephen saying there's two sides to the dynamic, and he went into some really amazing somatic work that we could do on our side. But even if that person has power and authority, if you will, we give it to them. We give them that power and authority. You can say, well, they took it. Well, there's always fear in the equation. We kind of go back to that earlier. Like part of the challenge, oftentimes, with folks coming forward to challenge someone else, is that and the question I typically ask is, well, what are you afraid of? And then what? What are you afraid of if that happens and that happens? And it's like, I'll lose my job. I'm afraid I might lose ownership. I'm afraid I might get less of a distribution. I'm afraid I might hurt my inheritance. And we part of this work is digging into it's owning the fear we have. It's not blaming the fear. It's not shaming the fear. It's not feeling bad about that. It's just knowing that we do, but understanding deeper why, because the sooner we can face the fear and recognize the fear for where it lives in us and do this work, the sooner we can address the challenge and have the conversation. Because it's how we've been participating in that dynamic that keeps that dynamic alive on both sides. So how we can show up differently changes the formulation of that dynamic that Stephen's talking about on many different levels.